In general, I think the whole of Clause 20 should stand part and be dropped from the bill. The other amendments I put my name to are mitigating in case this very dangerous clause is not dropped, but I remain hopeful that the Government will realise that despite what the noble Baroness Carberry just argued, that no doubt unintentionally, this will not only be bad for business and a range of institutions that are public-facing, but will also be detrimental to workers. I appreciate the Government is seeking to reassure and dampen down the public unease about this clause. Their suggestions that campaigners are hyping up the threat that it could pose to free speech. But I've yet to hear a convincing positive argument for why legislation is being used to create this sweeping new duty that will significantly expand all employers' liability for third-party harassment of their employees. It's unclear to me why, if any employee has evidence of harassment as just described, then they don't call the police. Shouldn't this be left to the criminal law to deal with it, rather than extending employment law? This clause puts all the onus on employers to plan for, prevent and police alleged problematic interactions, a task they're simply not qualified to do and indeed should have no right to do. This clause amends the Equality Act. It reinstates liability for the harassment of employees by third parties. That was in the original 2010 Act, as we know. But after the then coalition government consulted on the matter, there was such a negative feedback that it was kicked out in 2013. Why has it now reappeared with no consultation? What's more, this new duty is considerably more onerous. For example, there are no exemptions, and one of the amendments that I have my name to tries to at least carve out especially vulnerable sectors. What's more, as we've heard, employers would be liable for any single act of harassment by a third party. In its previous iteration, that would have they'd only have been liable if the employee was harassed for the third time. Again, there's an amendment to remedy this. To date, the Government hasn't presented any evidence that would justify ignoring the reasons that the original clause was rebutted. What has changed that demands this? Superficially, protecting employees from harassment sounds fair enough to all of us, but a lot hinges on what we consider harassment to mean. Firstly, one confusion to clarify. Sometimes the clause is bundled together with sexual harassment, and this conflation can give Clause 20 cause a moral force that's not merited. But I just need to be clear, as others have been, that Clause 20 is liability for third-party, non-sexual harassment. Then there's a common-sense notion of harassment in people's minds. That's understandable but misplaced. Lord Sumption, in relation to Hayes versus Willoughby in 2013, said of harassment that it's, quote, an ordinary English word with a well-understood meaning. And he went on to say harassment is a persistent and deliberate course of reasonable and oppressive conduct targeted at another person, which is calculated to and does cause that person alarm, fear or distress. But if only that was the definition, because unfortunately Lord Sumption's wise thoughts that harassment has a well-understood meaning is not true in 2025 era of lawfare. In relation to Section 26 of the Equality Act, harassment is defined as unwanted conduct relating to protected characteristics. And according to the EHRC guidance, we're given examples that this can include spoken words, banter, jokes, written words and imagery, physical gestures, facial expressions, social media posts. That is a very broad catch-all list of forms of harassment that now employers will have to protect their employees from when encountering third parties. Harassment under the Equality Act also includes indirect harassment, and I can't see any way for an employer to seek to comply with this when they will be compelled to take all reasonable steps to prevent their staff from encountering, even overhearing, those conversations, those jokes, those remarks that they might find upsetting in view of their protected characteristics. Also, harassment cases taken to employment tribunals increasingly concern conduct having the effect of harassment rather than behaviour intended to have that effect. So the motives or intentions of the third party are irrelevant. As well, I've noticed that in response to previous speeches which have raised concerns about this clause, the Government has argued that it won't be enough for the claimant simply to claim that someone's conduct is offensive, that there's an objective test in which the reasonableness and facts of the individual situation will always be considered. But in every iteration of harassment in law, in codes of conduct, including our own here in the Lords. In all elements of regulating hate speech, for example, a key factor is the perception of the claimant. It is unduly subjective, something I've raised as a problem on numerous occasions, only to be told by government ministers that victims' feelings are a core component. I'd be more than happy if the government were proposing amending the equality law to tighten this up and indeed to narrow down indirect harassment, but in the present circumstances, Clause 20 is a minefield and opens the door to egregious and boundless litigation across the board. I also want to consider who are these third parties. Maybe in the government's mind they are leery, drunken, rich businessmen shouting abuse, or some mythical antisocial, boorish bigots roaming around public-facing establishments, hunting down hard-pressed staff to harass. In reality, who is it who goes to the football or the rugby and may fall foul of the law, as the noble Lord Young illustrated? Who are they? They are other workers who on their days off relax by supporting their sports clubs and don't mince their words while doing so. And who do the government think frequents pubs? It could well be the workmates who go for a pint after a long shift and may want to let off steam by moaning about their bosses, only for a member of bar staff to take their lively views personally and feel harassed. Or a group of care workers gossiping away as they get their nails done, maybe discussing the local grooming gang scandal, and someone who works at the beauty salon takes offence. What about the bunch of apprentices who are on a night out at a comedy gig who join the heckling banter and perhaps shout something that a staff member or a steward says insults their protected characteristic? Or the ex-police officer reading a Brexity book in the cafe and chatting to a staff member about it, etc., etc. In other words, third parties, beyond some abstract legalese, in the flesh, are fellow workers trying to spend private time unassailed by undue backdoor state regulation of their speech and leisure. To note as well that in universities, third parties are not just external speakers, but students who are now considered consumers and customers. Already without this clause, there's a growing phenomenon of university management imposing rigorous speech codes on the student body in the form of anti-harassment policies under the guise of dignity at work and study policies. Many of us who are campaigners for free speech, the Free Speech Union, or my colleagues at the Academy of Ideas and Living Freedom, are working with students to roll back these very policies that are a serious threat to academic freedom. Clause 20 wouldn't just justify such censorious policing of student speech, but would in effect necessitate it, because it would be remiss for any university not to take steps to minimise the liability risk of students offending academic staff and making them feel unsafe and complaining of harassment. I'm also, finally, concerned about the disproportionate effect this will have on groups in society who hold dissenting views, expressions of which are too easily and regularly misrepresented as harassment. Surely any business that operates as venues, part of the hospitality industry, will seek to manage their liability by a risk-averse approach to any potentially contentious gatherings booking their premises. You can just imagine the conversations. Oh God, no, those evangelical Christians want to book a room again. That could be seen as harassing our gay staff. Oh damn, that pro-Israel group want to hold a meeting here, but lots of the catering staff are pro-Palestinian migrants. It's a bit risky. That Bolshevik Women's Rights Network and Let Women Speak lot have arranged to meet here with all those customers wearing women equals adult human female t-shirts. That's bound to wind up our right on trans ally bar staff. Just tell them we're fully booked. In other words, Clause 20 could lead to overly cautious, better safe than sorry, informal blacklists. It could radically change and toxify the relationship between businesses and their customers. It's no longer the customer is always right, and you can forget about improving customer service. Now customers are third-party harassment risks to staff. We live in an era of divisive cancel culture. This misplaced assertion of the right not to be offended threatens social cohesion. We, as legislators, should be seeking to dismantle this culture, not adding to it, as this Clause 20 absolutely does.
Yeah.